The U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs discusses democracy and upcoming elections and the political changes in Zimbabwe and Angola. The President of Namibia on his country's progress towards meeting sustainable development goals and boosting investment. And photographers seek to preserve African rituals and heritage. Africa 54 starts right now.
Good evening, I'm Esther Gidui. You were in for Vincent Makori. This is Africa 54. We'll have those stories in a moment, but we begin tonight with U.S. President Donald Trump's America First foreign policy speech to the 73rd session of the UN General Assembly, which drew mixed reaction from world leaders. VOA's Elizabeth Chernoff has our report looking at the international community's response.
Just a few minutes into his speech to the UN General Assembly, President Donald Trump got an unusual response.
In less than 2 years, my administration has accomplished more than almost any administration in the history of our country. America's so true. Didn't expect that reaction, but that's okay.
Echoing similar themes in his speech from last year, Trump praised patriotism over globalism, but some leaders in the international community pushed back. Invoking climate change, France's president called on countries to reject trade deals with any countries unwilling to abide by the Paris Climate Agreement, which the U.S. has withdrawn from.
We won't sign any more trade agreements with countries that do not respect the Paris Agreement. Let's make sure that our commercial commitments integrate our environmental and social constraints.
Before his address, Trump offered sharp criticism of Iran.
Iran has to change its tune before I meet with them. They want to meet. I'm not meeting with them until they change their tune. It will happen. I believe they have no choice. We look forward to having a great relationship with Iran.
But Iran's president had this rebuke of the U.S.
I am starting the dialogue right here and state in unequivocal terms that the question of international security is not a toy in American domestic politics. The United Nations is not a part of the United States administration.
From pulling out of multilateral pacts to slapping tariffs on foreign goods, some experts say it's part of a broader strategy to disrupt the status quo.
That's particularly harmful to the post-World War II order because the United States built it. It is the architect and the main defender. And so to have someone in Washington who is trying to bring that order down is quite a change.
This week's United Nations meetings continue through Friday, with North Korea and the proliferation of nuclear weapons on the agenda in the days ahead. Elizabeth Chernoff, VOA News, Washington.
Now, for more on the ongoing United Nations General Assembly, I am joined by VOA White House correspondent Steve Herman. Steve, thank you for joining us. U.S. President Donald Trump chaired the UN Security Council meeting this morning. What were the highlights of this meeting?
Yeah, it's a very unusual scene because this is only the third time that a U.S. president has taken the gavel at the Security Council. Barack Obama did it twice, and when they did that, there was some resolution on the table, but that wasn't the case today. This was supposed to be a session devoted to non-proliferation, but as he is wont to President Trump sort of broadened the definition of that, and much of his commentary was about Iran, and specifically warnings to Iran and warnings to any of those who continue to do business with Iran after the United States withdrew from that 2015 nuclear agreement. A little bit about North Korea in there, and those were mostly positive things. The president looking forward to a second summit with North Korea's leader, Kim Jong-un, which he indicated could happen in a matter of months.
Now, Steve, he also spoke about personal distractions right here at home.
Yes, well, there are a lot of distractions for the president while he is here in New York this week. Of course, We had what's being referred to as that fire drill with whether the #2 person at the Justice Department who oversees the Russia investigation was resigning or being fired. The president, again, making comments that he'll be fired tomorrow. And then also there is the distraction of the Supreme Court nominee, Brett Kavanaugh, who is facing all sorts of accusations from various individuals, women from his past, who say that he either made some sort of a sexual assault on them or he witnessed that. So a lot of distractions for the president while he's here.
Steve, we've had the president talk about the unfair trade deals, but again, now we hear him mention China, not on the unfair trade deals, but also about meddling in the midterm elections here in the U.S.
Yes, we've heard a lot about Russia meddling in the 2016 presidential election that led to the Trump victory. But in the past couple of days, the White House now speaking about Chinese interference in this year's midterm election, which will happen in November, and the president telling the Security Council that the Chinese don't want him to be victorious, namely his party, because he's not on the ballot in November, because he's being so tough on trade. No specific details yet about exactly what the president's referring to as far as any evidence of that.
And his plate, Steve, appears to be full. What do you expect to hear from him in his address this afternoon?
Well, he's going to give a news conference at 5 o'clock local time. It's very rare that the president does a news conference. He's done a number of these so-called bilaterals in the East Room of the White House or in the Rose Garden when there's another leader beside him. And, you know, the big headline coming out of that could be some question that some reporter from somewhere in the world, because we're told 300 reporters are being invited, could ask him, and the president makes an off-the-cuff remark, and we have new outrage and new headlines. So stay tuned, and we'll see what happens.
Well, Steve, thank you so much for reporting that for us. We'll also be monitoring what the First Lady will be talking about as she prepares for her trip to Africa. Steve Herman is VOA White House correspondent, reporting live for us there from the United Nations. Now, recent positive changes in Zimbabwe and Angola serve as proof of what enlightened leadership can accomplish in Africa. That's the word of newly appointed U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, Tibor Nagy. Nagy is the former ambassador to Ethiopia and Guinea. He has also held several diplomatic posts in Southern and West Africa. Africa 54's Heidi Adam Fitzpatrick sat down with him in New York to talk about the future of America's relationship with Africa. She began by asking him whether the U.S. is satisfied with developments in the Democratic Republic of Congo ahead of the elections there in December.
Oftentimes, it's assumed that the United States supports opposition candidates in all of these African elections. The absolute truth is, and I can't underline this strongly enough, that the United States has no candidates in any election. Our only candidate is always the process, as long as the process is fair, transparent, and the elections are credible. This is what we would like to see. I think this is what most of the international community would very much like to see, that the people of the DRC have a choice, a real choice in electing their next leader.
Are you happy with what you're seeing so far?
Let me put it this way. I have gone from being pessimistic to being more agnostic. Oftentimes, unfortunately, people are focused on the day of the elections. And often the day of the elections go off fine, but the pre-electoral period is critically important to make sure that all eligible voters are allowed and have a chance to register. And of course, in the post-electoral period as to how that unfolds, and to make sure that the right person is inaugurated who was elected by the people.
Let's move now to Zimbabwe, where we have actually had an election, and we have seen the transfer of power from one individual to another, albeit within the same party. The United States, along with the international community, were instrumental in really through international sanctions, isolating Robert Mugabe's Zimbabwe. It seems that change appears to be on the horizon. So what is the United States willing now to do to help rebuild Zimbabwe and help it reintegrate into the family of prosperous nations?
We sure hope that real change is on the horizon, because the fact is that Zimbabwe could be one of the stars of Africa. There's almost not a sector that Zimbabwe could not excel at. What is key now is real action. The legislation and sanctions against Zimbabwe are quite specific and also specific in what needs to be done to, again, open up that space. If these steps come into being, then I would become a huge cheerleader with the U.S. business sector to say, absolutely, you know, this has happened now, so look at Zimbabwe as a possibility for investment, because at the end of the day, it's not going to be any amount of international development assistance that will move a country from, you know, low-income developing to middle income. It's going to be foreign direct investment. We see that over and over again, you know, throughout the world, because there's massive amounts of international capital looking for good places to invest. But for that, the business community needs transparency. They need to know that it's a corruption-free environment and that they can get a fair return on their investment.
Speaking of more change, almost sort of the same that we're seeing in Zimbabwe, another example of transfer of power from one individual to another within the same party in Angola. President dos Santos virtually handpicked João Lourenço, and he's been on a rather aggressive anti-corruption drive. Is there a pathfinder here? Is there a lesson for the rest of Africa?
Absolutely. And that shows you the difference literally that one leader can make, because the Angolans have taken some steps, you know, especially on the corruption front. And if investors are very sophisticated, especially those investors who are looking at developing markets like Africa. If the investors are beating down the door to go to a country, that is definitely a very positive signal. Whether it's a new leader who takes these steps or somebody who's been in the system for a long time, when they're taking proven positive steps, as has happened, Angola is one of the examples, then the business community responds immediately. You know, formalized organizations, whether it's a government or other large organizations, may take time. But for the business community, you know, responding quickly is their lifeblood. So it's a very good indication of the positive changes going on in Angola.
Now, on Thursday, we'll bring you part 2 of Haiti's interview with U.S. Assistant Secretary of State Nagy on the wave of changes in Ethiopia, America's relationship with Nigeria, and China's growing presence in Africa. So be sure to join us. Now, more than 1,000 women in the northeastern Nigerian state of Borno are urging the government to free their husbands and sons who have been detained for years on suspicion of being members of the extremist group Boko Haram. The women say they have not received any information about the whereabouts of their loved ones. Chika Odua reports from Maiduguri in Borno State.
Not knowing where your children are is every parent's worst nightmare. Bintu's 2 sons have been gone for 5 years now. Sitting in their bedroom, she's overwhelmed with grief. Dunoma and Abuna were high school students when soldiers arrested them in 2013 on suspicion of having links to the extremist group Boko Haram.
One night, soldiers came around 3 a.m., hitting our door and shouting, "Where are the boys? Where are the boys? Bring out your sons."
Her other children have been growing up for years without their 2 older brothers. Local activist Hamsatu Alamin has been hearing stories similar to Bintu's of women whose husbands and sons have been detained for years. So she's created a network to help them.
This network is to seek accountability for the whereabouts of these children. As you can see the environment, this is how all members of my network are. Poor, wretched people, no voices. They don't even know where to go and start asking.
More than 1,000 women have now come together. In this refugee camp, they share their stories. And they're active. Earlier this year, they wrote an open letter to President Muhammadu Buhari, begging to be reunited with their sons and husbands, whom they say have no ties to Boko Haram. Some of them could be caught up in Nigeria's notoriously slow legal system. This month, Human Rights Watch denounced the trials of Boko Haram suspects as flawed by legal shortcomings. While the case seen here is not Boko Haram related, this court has handled the largest number of such cases in the region.
When you go through it, you realize that definitely they have a reason. They have reasons to be brought here. But then this is always common, not here in Nigeria, everywhere. People talk of abuse of human rights. It is not the courts that are at fault.
The people whose families have been torn apart by the Boko Haram insurgency don't know who is at fault. But occasionally, something special happens. This mother hasn't seen her son since he was arrested years ago on suspicion of being a Boko Haram member. He's now been cleared and released from detention. Their reunion draws attention. For Bintu, she still awaits her own reunion. Forever hopeful, she goes through their old school papers as a way to keep her memory of them alive. Chika Odua for VOA News, Maiduguri.
We want to know what you think about Africa 54 and the stories we cover. Join the conversation on Facebook. The address is Africa 54. We're also streaming our show live on Facebook, so check us out and share our show with your friends. Still ahead on Africa 54, Namibia's progress towards meeting the Sustainable Development Goals and boosting investment. But first, a look at Wednesday's headlines.
Violence over the past 2 years in Cameroon's Anglophone region, which has killed and displaced tens of thousands, have also caused a major decline in tourism. In South Africa, stun grenades were fired by police at protesters who gathered in the streets of Cape Town to rally against the country's recessive economy. In Egypt, 2 Cairo districts, Maspera and Warak, are facing demolition as part of a movement to attract investment and boost the economy. Elections in the Democratic Republic of Congo are set to be held as scheduled despite ongoing violence over President Joseph Kabila's refusal to step down in 2016. Finally, since the killing of dictator Muammar Gaddafi in a popular uprising in 2011, rival factions continue to jockey for power and influence over the country's internationally recognized government.
Africa 54's Lino Mudu is in New York for the UN General Assembly, and she caught up with Namibia's President Hage Geingob. They discussed a variety of topics, including addressing poverty and improving foreign investment relations in the country.
Poverty, to me, is the biggest problem in Africa, especially when society is divided in haves and have-nots, and that is painted with color. West. So in our country, as a settler colony, where white people came to settle, and they are citizens of Namibia, but we have unequal situation where those who are privileged are still enjoying the land situation, even in economy. So our problem, therefore, is that, look, we must build Namibian house, holding hands, all of us, black, white, yellow, and live together. But we must also look in sharing in our resources. We must create a situation where we can use our land, all of us and Namibians together.
You're hosting an investment forum to attract American investors. What is the message to the investors?
Namibia is ready to do business with you. As I said, good governance, peace, unity provides conducive investment climate. Namibia provides that. You can easily repatriate your profits. It's a peaceful country. It has all the amenities for investors, and also people want to have recreational facilities. We have infrastructure developed. So we are saying, come now, Namibia is ready in agro industry. In mining, of course, mining is the main thing, but also the energy. Talking about all of Southern Africa, we have energy deficit. These are all in wind energy. You have the solar energy possibilities. So energy mix is there, but whole of Southern Africa has problems. So come, doors are open, friendly people who welcome you.
And some critics say that African countries do not trade among themselves as much as they should. What is your take on this issue?
The problem we have in Africa is that we have to add value to our resources. We are trading in raw materials. Now Botswana and Namibia have diamonds. How do you trade? Unless we add value to our diamonds, so my jewelry may be better, therefore I could trade, but we have beef, we have diamonds. And besides that, we're always looking outwards. Now we are looking inward so that we can discuss as Africans and trade internally.
Earlier this year, you traveled to China, and I want to talk about China, where you met with President Xi Jinping. What transpired from this meeting with regards to cooperation, China-Namibia cooperation?
Well, China is opening and is not only in Africa. I used to like Waldorf Astoria here. It was bought by Chinese. Chinese also bailed out American economy here. So Chinese are really going out to Africa. We are welcoming them, provided, as they told me once, when I asked them, oh, comrades, I see all these Western businesses here. They said, we opened up 30 years ago. However, that's very important, however, whoever comes here comes on our own terms. In Africa, people go on their terms. So Chinese can come, Americans can come, but they must come on our own terms.
Because a lot of skeptics are saying China's motives are not very clear, and they are asking African countries if they really understand what they're getting themselves into.
So that's an insult.
Yeah.
I reject that. They are trying to say Africans are small-minded, they are children, they don't understand. Who can tell us that? We fought for our freedom, not supported by Western countries. We gained our independence, not to exchange it with somebody else. I said that in China.
President Gaigob, thank you so much for your time.
You are welcome.
Now, the African Development Bank is spearheading efforts to provide agricultural innovation for African farmers and opportunities for investment. And looking into obstacles that stand in their way, the Continental Bank is also promoting intra-Africa trade. And joining me live via Skype from Indianapolis, Indiana, is Dr. Akinwumi Adesina, the president of the African Development Bank. Akinwumi Adesina, welcome again to Africa 54. And let's start off quickly by looking at how intra-Africa trade is doing in terms of investment from your organization's perspective.
Well, I think that there's no doubt that Africa has been trading quite a lot outside of the continent. But as it does that, especially trades in raw materials and commodities, it's not good for Africa. So Africa doesn't account for more than 2% of global trade. And so we've been pushing quite hard for Africa to trade a lot within itself. I think the Continental Free Trade Area, which was announced, is going to be, you're looking at combined GDP of $3.4 trillion. That will make that Continental Free Trade Area in Africa the largest in the world. And so, but to take advantage of that, we need to do a number of things. And so the African Development Bank is investing heavily in infrastructure just to get access to power, so you can have industries that are actually able to process and add value to things. We're investing in transnational highways to link landlocked countries to coastal countries. We are investing in port, in rail, and all the critical things that are necessary for infrastructure. Look, infrastructure is continued to be a challenge for Africa. The gap that Africa has for infrastructure is anything between $68 billion to $108 billion a year. And so our role as Africa's Continental Bank is to continue to attract a lot of investment from the private sector to close that infrastructure gap. And I think we are succeeding quite well.
Dr. Adesina, one of the questions that is raised, time and again is about investor confidence. When you look at Africa, most of the times the policies are set in place, but sometimes they are changed depending on who comes to power in Africa. How do we guard against that kind of change? Anybody coming into political leadership decides, okay, this is not working and I'm going to do away with it.
Well, Africa is not one country. Africa is made up of 54 countries. I must say that if you look at the Doing Business Global report that's published by the World Bank, you'll find that Africa, just over a year ago, accounted for over 30% of all the business and regulatory investments done global. If you look at foreign direct investment, in 2010 in Africa, it was no more than $10 billion. By last year, it was $60 billion. 6 out of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world are in Africa. And so the narrative is Africa is actually working. Now, just like you would go to Europe, you go to the United States, you go to everywhere, you find kinks when you're making transactions. That occurs in other places as well. It's not unique to Africa. African markets are not as risky as people think. I think the perception of risk is excessively high when it comes to Africa. You were just talking moments ago about China investing $60 billion in Africa. Why is India investing massively in Africa? South Korea investing massively in Africa. They are seeing a market that is so huge. You cannot ignore the African market. You are seeing a rapidly rising population, middle class rising, and you are seeing a market where business-to-business transaction will reach $3.5 trillion by 2030, and consumer expenditures will be over $2.5 trillion. So the key is we are working to make sure, obviously, that investors can come to the continent and also have their capital work for them here. That's why the African Development Bank launched what's called the Africa Investment Forum, which is holding from 7th to the 9th of November in Johannesburg, South Africa. We're building the world, we're bringing the world's capital markets to Africa to invest with bankable projects. We're going to de-risk those projects to make sure that we reduce market risk, financial risk, political risk that faces investors, and most importantly, to have a conversation with African heads of state about how to further improve the policy, business, and investment and regulatory environment. We're doing everything we can to make sure investors can land their investments in Africa in a very smooth way.
Dr. Adesina, thank you very much. Time is really not on our side today, but that's Dr. Akinwumi Adesina, the president of the African Development Bank, talking to us via Skype from Indianapolis. And welcome back to Africa 54. Here's what's trending. A traditional fertility ritual performed in a remote village in Burkina Faso. Many of these ceremonies are unknown outside the communities in which they take place and are increasingly in danger of being lost in today's modernizing world. Photographers Angela Fisher and Carol Beckwith have made it their life's work to document many examples of unique rituals such as this. Beckwith says they want to give context to the ceremonies they've witnessed and tell the stories behind the ritual artifacts that have now become collector's items. A tribal art fair is held in central London every year. Only a handful of the collectors and dealers at the fair are from Africa. And that's our show for today. Good night from Washington.
Welcome to English in a Minute. When you slip, you fall down. But how does something slip from your mind?
Slip one's mind.
Let's listen to Anna and Jonathan.
Look at this beautiful cake I made for the dinner party.
Oh no, is that tonight?
Yes. Didn't you make something?
No, it totally slipped.